She signed the papers the same way she used to sign birthday cards. Quickly, without looking up. I stood in the kitchen doorway watching her, a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and I thought, 31 years. That's how long we've been married. 31 years. And she signed away my share of the lake house we built together like she was approving a grocery list. The attorney says it's just a formality, my daughter-in-law said from across the table. She didn't look at me either. My son, my own son, cleared his throat and stacked the papers into a neat pile. Dad, it's just easier this way. For everyone. I nodded. I said okay. I took my coffee to the back porch and sat down in a chair I'd been sitting in for 20 years, looking out at the yard I'd mowed 10,000 times. And I did not say another word. That was a Tuesday in October. By the following Thursday, everything had changed. I should back up. My name is Walter. I'm 63 years old. I spent 34 years as a civil engineer for the county, bridges, drainage systems, road foundations, work that nobody notices until it fails. I retired 4 years ago with a clean record, a decent pension, and the understanding that my wife and I would finally have time together. Travel a little. See the grandchildren. Breathe. My wife's name is Diane. We met when I was 29 and she was 27, at a church potluck of all places. She brought a green bean casserole. I thought she was the most capable-looking woman I'd ever seen. That's what I noticed first. Not her eyes, not her smile, but the way she carried herself like she already knew how everything was going to turn out. I found that quality beautiful for a long time. Later, I would understand it differently. Our son is named Garrett. He's 38. He works in commercial real estate and has his mother's ability to make decisions feel like they were already made before you arrived in the room. He married a woman named Becca 7 years ago. Becca is organized, efficient, and has never once in 7 years asked me a question she didn't already know the answer to. For most of our marriage, I thought we were a solid family. Disagreements, sure. Distance at times, yes. But solid. The kind of family that shows up. I coached Garrett's Little League teams. I drove him to college and helped him move into his dorm. I walked Diane through her mother's illness and sat beside her at the funeral. I paid the mortgage on time for 30 years. I fixed the furnace. I repainted the porch. I stayed. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that for the last 2 years, my wife and my son had been quietly rearranging things. Financial things. Property things. Things with my name on them. I found out by accident. It started with a letter. I'm old-fashioned about mail. I still open everything myself. Still keep a filing system in the second drawer of my desk in the study. In September, about 6 weeks before that Tuesday in the kitchen, I received a letter from a title company I didn't recognize. It referenced a property transaction on the lake house, the one in Tennessee that Diane and I had purchased together in 2009. We put both our names on the deed. We'd spent 16 summers there with Garrett, and later with Garrett and Becca, and later still with our 2 grandchildren. The letter was a notification of a deed amendment. My name had been removed. I read it 3 times. Then I sat down. The amendment had been filed 8 months earlier. The signatures on file included Diane's and a notary, and listed as the receiving party on the updated deed, Garrett and Becca. I didn't say anything to Diane that night. I want to be clear about that decision. I didn't confront her. I didn't raise my voice. I went to dinner. I passed the bread. I asked about her sister's knee surgery, and I listened to her talk for 40 minutes about a documentary she'd watched, about monarch butterflies. And after she went to bed, I went to my study and I started making calls. The next morning, I contacted a real estate attorney named Paul, a man I'd been referred to years ago and never needed until now. I explained what I'd found. He pulled the records himself within the hour. Walter, he said, there are some serious issues here. Did you sign anything authorizing this transfer? I had not. Do you have any memory of being presented with documents, anything, even something that seemed routine? I did not. Paul told me that a deed transfer without both owners' consent was not a formality. It was a legal problem, a significant one. He told me not to confront anyone yet. He told me to let him look further. I thanked him and hung up, and I sat in my study in the dark for a long time. I thought about the monarch butterflies, how Diane had described them making their migration without ever being taught the route, how she'd said it was one of the most beautiful things she'd ever heard of. Creatures that simply knew where they were going. I thought about what it meant, that she could sit across from me and say that with her eyes bright. while knowing what she'd done. Paul called back 2 days later. He found more. Beyond the lake house, there were two other items of concern. The first was a joint investment account that Diane and I had held since 1998. Over the course of 14 months, the account had been drawn down by transfers to a new individual account, in Diane's name only. The total moved was just over $90,000. Each transfer had been small enough to avoid automatic review flags. They had been careful about that. The second item was the business. When I retired, I had taken a small consulting arrangement with a former colleague. Nothing large, just occasional project reviews for a local engineering firm. The arrangement included a deferred compensation structure that was tied to a holding agreement co-signed by Diane for tax purposes. That holding agreement had been quietly modified. The modification redirected any future payouts to a different account, one I didn't recognize. Paul was very calm when he explained all this. He had the kind of voice that doesn't change pitch when the news is bad. "Walter, I want to ask you something directly. Is there any possibility your wife has been receiving legal advice about separating assets in anticipation of a divorce proceeding?" I said I didn't know. Because this pattern, the incremental transfers, the deed amendment, the modification to the holding agreement, this doesn't look improvised. This looks planned. I asked him how long. He was quiet for a moment. Based on the earliest document I can trace, at least 22 months. 22 months. I had been sitting across the dinner table from my wife for 22 months while she was executing a plan to remove me from our shared financial life. And my son knew. He was on the deed. He had received the lake house. He knew. I told Paul to proceed carefully. I told him I wasn't ready to act yet. I needed a few more days. "Walter," he said, "I understand. But I want you to be aware. If she files for divorce before a move to protect your position, you'll be starting from a much weaker place." I understood. I told him I'd be in touch by the end of the week. That weekend was Garrett and Becca's anniversary dinner. They hosted it at their house, a nice house in a suburb 40 minutes from ours. Diane had been talking about it for 2 weeks. She'd ordered a gift. She'd made a reservation at a restaurant nearby for the adults after the kids went to bed. I went. I sat at the table. I helped Garrett carry in the extra chairs from the garage. I let my granddaughter climb into my lap and tell me about a book she was reading about horses. I watched my wife laugh at something Becca said and refill her wine glass and touch Garrett's arm with the ease of a woman who had nothing to be ashamed of. And I thought, they don't know that I know. That thought was the only thing that kept me steady. Not anger, not grief, just that one clear fact sitting in the center of my chest like a stone. They don't know that I know. And that gap between what they believed and what was actually true was the only thing I had. I intended to use it carefully. On Monday morning, I called Paul and told him to proceed. I told him I wanted everything documented, every account protected that could still be protected, and I wanted to understand exactly what my legal position was before a single word was said in my house. He had already begun. By Wednesday of that week, Paul had filed protective orders on 2 of the remaining joint accounts. He had documented the unauthorized deed transfer and the modification to the holding agreement and referred both to a colleague who handled financial fraud. He had contacted the state licensing board regarding the notary who had processed the deed amendment without my signature, because forging or improperly notarizing a deed transfer is not a civil matter, it is a criminal one. He also connected me with a forensic accountant who began reviewing the full scope of transfers over the past 2 years. That Wednesday evening, I came home to find Diane on the phone in the living room. She stopped talking when I walked in. She said, "I'll call you back," in the particular low voice people use when they don't want to be overheard. And then she smiled at me and asked if I was hungry. I said I'd eaten something on the way home. She nodded and went back to her phone in the other room. I went to my study, closed the door, and wrote down everything I remembered. Every dinner, every conversation, every document I've been handed in the last 2 years that I'd signed without reading closely. I wrote for 2 hours. Then I emailed it to Paul. Thursday came. That morning, Diane got up early and told me she was meeting her sister for coffee. She took her large purse, the one she used when she was carrying documents, and she left at 8:15. I watched her car pull out of the driveway from the front window. 20 minutes later, Paul called me. "Walter, I need to tell you something. I received a call this morning from Diane's attorney." I asked him to repeat that. She has an attorney, has had one apparently for some time. He called to inform me that Diane intends to file for divorce. He was calling as a professional courtesy to give me advance notice. Paul paused. I think she found out you'd retained me. I asked how. One of the protective orders generated a notification to the joint account. She would have seen it. I sat down. What does this mean for us? It means we move today. Right now, this morning. I've already drafted the filings. I just needed your authorization. I gave it. By noon, Paul had filed on my behalf. Documentation of the unauthorized deed transfer. Documentation of the unauthorized deed transfer. A formal complaint to the county DA's office regarding the fraudulent notarization. A motion to freeze the remaining joint assets pending divorce proceedings. Everything that had been quietly, carefully built over the past 10 days, deployed in a single morning. And then I went and sat on my back porch. Because there was nothing left to do but wait. The call came 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, while I was raking leaves in the backyard. It was Garrett. I almost didn't answer. I stood there for a moment looking at his name on the screen, and I thought about all the leaves still on the ground, and how the yard would look the same whether I answered or not. Then I answered. Dad. His voice was tight in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager. Dad, what is going on? Mom's attorney says you filed some kind of fraud claim. The lake house is frozen. There's something about a DA referral. Yes, I said. He stopped. I think he expected more from me. An explanation, a denial, a raised voice, something to push against. Dad, you need to understand, this could affect Becca and me. The house is in our name. I know whose name it's in, I said. That's the problem. He went quiet. Garrett, I said, and I tried to keep my voice even, which wasn't hard because I had been practicing this conversation in my mind for 2 weeks. I know about the deed. I know about the account transfers. I know about the modification to the holding agreement. I know how long this has been going on. And I want you to understand something. I'm not doing this to hurt you. I'm doing this because it's the legal and correct response to what was done. He started to say something about my mother, meaning Diane, about how she had her reasons, about how things hadn't been good between us for a long time, about how they were just trying to protect her. She had her reasons, I said, and she had 2 years to talk to me about them. She chose a different path. That path has consequences. He said, Dad, please, can we just have your attorney call Paul? I said, that's the right way to handle this now. And I hung up. I stood in my backyard with the phone in one hand and the rake in the other, and I looked up at the sky, which was that particular gray blue that you only get in October, and I breathed. What happened over the following weeks was not simple, and it was not clean. Divorce proceedings rarely are. Paul worked methodically through everything: the asset documentation, the fraud referrals, the protective orders. Diane's attorney pushed back on several points. There were letters and counterletters and a mediation session that lasted 4 hours and accomplished almost nothing. The notary who had processed the deed amendment was investigated. I won't say more than that, except that the investigation was not closed quickly and the findings were not favorable to the notary. The forensic accountant completed her review. The total amount transferred out of joint accounts over 22 months was higher than Paul's initial estimate, significantly higher. I won't pretend I felt nothing. I want to be honest about that. There were evenings in that house, evenings after Diane had moved out and taken what she was entitled to take, where the silence had a specific weight to it. I'd spent 31 years building a life with someone. I had believed things that turned out not to be true. That doesn't go away cleanly. It sits in the room with you. You learn to let it sit there without letting it make your decisions. The grandchildren were the hardest part. My granddaughter with her horse books. My grandson who always wanted to show me things on his tablet. I didn't know, in those early weeks, how much access I would have. That uncertainty was worse than anything else. It turned out better than I feared. Not perfect, but better. 6 weeks after that Sunday phone call from Garrett, I received a message from Diane directly. We had not spoken since she moved out. Her attorney had advised against direct contact, and so had Paul. But she sent a message through my personal email, not through the attorney's. She said she hadn't expected it to go this way. She said she wanted me to understand that she hadn't meant for things to become what they became. She said she hoped I knew she hadn't meant to hurt me. I read it twice. I thought about a lot of things. I thought about the butterfly documentary she'd described over dinner that Tuesday evening in October, and how she'd smiled, and how none of what she was doing had showed on her face at all. I wrote back one sentence. I said the way to not hurt someone is to tell them the truth while there's still time to change course. That window is closed now. I didn't hear from her again after that. I want to say something to anyone who might be listening to this. Not advice, exactly. Just something I've had to sit with. I am 63 years old. I have seen people my age go through hard things and come out of them carrying bitterness like furniture, hauling it from room to room, rearranging it, never quite putting it down. I understand that impulse. I have felt it, but here's what I learned in those weeks between finding that letter in October and standing in my backyard with a rake in November. The most important thing I did was not react. Not immediately. I found out what was true. I found the right help. I let the process do what the process is designed to do, and I didn't let the shock of what I discovered collapse my judgment. I am not saying that was easy. I am saying it was the only thing that gave me any ground to stand on. The lake house is still in dispute as part of the proceedings. I don't know yet how that will resolve. Some things take time to work through properly. What I know is that the documentation is thorough and the legal position is sound. Paul says he's seen worse situations come out well when the groundwork was laid correctly. I choose to believe him. My granddaughter called me last week and talked for 20 minutes about her horse book. She asked if I'd ever ridden a horse. I told her once, when I was younger than she is now, and it had not gone especially well for me or for the horse. She laughed. It was the best sound I'd heard in months. Some things hold, even when others don't. I'm still in the house, still sitting on the back porch in the mornings, still raking leaves when they fall. The yard looks the same. The gray-blue October sky has given way to something colder now, but I find I don't mind the cold as much as I used to. There's a kind of clarity in it. If you're going through something like this, if you picked up on something that doesn't add up, if there are documents you haven't looked at closely, if you have a feeling in your chest that you've been explaining away, trust that feeling. Don't confront first. Find out what's true first. Get the right help first. Quiet isn't the same as weak. I spent 34 years building structures designed to hold weight invisibly, roads people drove on without thinking about the engineering underneath, bridges that stood through weather and years and the constant pressure of use without announcing themselves. That's still who I am. I hold. I document. I do the work that doesn't show. And when it matters, when it really matters, I don't collapse.